That night was one of the craziest yet most exciting and intimate nights of my whole life. It all started one Saturday morning. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak of the floorboards feel amplified. I stood at the kitchen sink, my hands submerged in warm, soapy water, scrubbing the last of the dishes from breakfast. Everyone had left for the day, Mom and Dad out on one of their regular weekend trips, and it was just me and my stepbrother Ryan. It wasn't unusual for us to be home alone together, but today felt different. I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in my gut ever since I heard his voice echo down the stairs a few hours ago. The usual easygoing atmosphere between us had grown tense recently, a tension I couldn't quite place but couldn't ignore either. Maybe it was because, despite living together for the past few years, we were never that close. Or maybe it was something else, something unspoken. I finished drying my hands and turned around just as Ryan appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, arms crossed over his chest. His eyes lingered on me in a way that made my skin prickle with awareness. "Hey," he said, his voice casual, but there was an edge to it. "What are you doing?" "Just cleaning up," I replied, trying to keep my tone light, as if I wasn't feeling the tension rising with every second he stood there. He didn't respond immediately, just watched me, his gaze heavy, almost assessing. I shifted on my feet, the room feeling smaller under the weight of his attention. "You know, it's just us here today," Ryan said after a moment, his voice low, almost too quiet. The casual way he said it, like he was just stating a fact, sent a shiver down my spine. I wasn't sure why, but the way he lingered on the words made something flicker in the back of my mind. I nodded, keeping my hands busy as I wiped down the counter. "Yeah, I know. It's nice to have the house to ourselves." The room fell into a silence again, the kind of quiet that crackled with unspoken words, like something was about to happen but hadn't quite taken shape yet. I glanced at Ryan out of the corner of my eye. He hadn't moved from the doorway, but his expression had changed. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something darker, something that made my heart beat faster for reasons I didn't fully understand. He finally pushed off the doorframe and crossed the kitchen in a few slow steps. I could feel his presence beside me before I even looked up. He was close, too close, but I didn't move away. I wasn't sure why. "You've been acting strange lately," he said, his voice softer now, but there was a tension underneath it. "Is everything okay?" I looked up at him, startled by the question. "Me? Acting strange? What about you? You've barely said 2 words to me in the past week." Ryan let out a low chuckle, but it wasn't filled with humor. Maybe I just didn't know what to say. There was again that strange undercurrent in his voice, like there was something he wasn't telling me. I felt a lump form in my throat, the air between us growing thicker by the second. "Well, I started, my voice a bit shaky. I'm not the one making things weird. If something's on your mind, just say it." Ryan's gaze didn't waver, and for a second, I thought he was going to tell me, but instead, he stepped even closer, his shoulder brushing against mine as he leaned over to grab a glass from the counter. His arm grazed mine, sending an unexpected jolt through me. My breath hitched, and I felt the heat rise in my face. What was happening? "You're right," he finally said, his voice quieter than before. "I guess I've just been thinking a lot." The tension that had been simmering between us suddenly felt like it was reaching a boiling point. But I didn't know what to do. My instinct was to step back, to put distance between us, but I was frozen in place. "Thinking about what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper now. Ryan looked at me, his eyes intense, and for a moment the world seemed to slow down around us. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something I had never seen before. "You," he said simply, and the word hung in the air between us like a secret, heavy, and impossible to ignore. I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean?" His gaze never wavered, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. The look in his eyes, the way he was standing just a little too close, the way his voice had dropped when he spoke. It wasn't just tension I had been feeling all week. It was something more, something I hadn't been ready to acknowledge. He reached out then, his fingers brushing against my arm again, and this time, the touch lingered. I should have pulled away. I should have said something, anything, to break the tension, but instead, I stood there, frozen, as Ryan's hand moved up my arm, his touch sending sparks through my skin. "Ryan," I started, but my voice trailed off, lost in the sudden intensity of the moment. His eyes darkened as he leaned in closer, his breath warm against my ear. "No one will ever find out," he whispered, and just like that, the tension that had been building between us exploded into something I wasn't prepared for. Ryan's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as if they'd sucked all the oxygen from the room. "No one will ever find out." I swallowed hard, my pulse racing, and tried to move, but my feet felt glued to the floor. There was something so final in the way he said it, like he'd already made up his mind about whatever was happening between us. I don't think that's a good idea," I finally stammered, my voice shaky, but even as I said it, part of me wasn't sure if I meant it. Something about the way Ryan looked at me, like there was no one else in the world, was pulling me toward him, even though I knew I should be running in the opposite direction. He didn't back away. If anything, he stepped closer and the space between us disappeared entirely. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, his breath mingling with mine, and the air seemed to crackle with electricity. My heart pounded in my chest, and it took everything in me not to step back, not to break the spell that had fallen over us. "You sure about that?" Ryan whispered, his voice low, filled with a confidence I hadn't noticed before. "Because you've been acting like you're thinking the same thing." I flinched at his words, feeling my face flush with embarrassment. Was he right? Had I been giving him signals without even realizing it? The thought made my stomach twist into knots. I wasn't supposed to feel like this. Not about him. We were family now, or close enough that it felt like we were, and this, whatever this was, could never happen. But the look in Ryan's eyes told me he wasn't thinking about the consequences. He wasn't thinking about the fact that our parents were married or that we shared a home or that this would ruin everything if anyone found out. No! Ryan was focused solely on me, and the intensity of his gaze was impossible to ignore. "I can't," I said, though my voice lacked the conviction I'd hoped for. I wasn't even sure who I was trying to convince, him or myself. But Ryan wasn't deterred. He raised a hand and gently placed it on my cheek, his thumb brushing lightly across my skin. The touch was tender, but it sent a jolt through me, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't move, didn't pull away. Instead, I stood there, heart racing, as he leaned in, his lips just inches from mine. "Ryan, stop," I whispered. But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure if I wanted him to listen. There was a part of me that was screaming to get out of this situation, to walk away before things went any further. But there was another part, a darker part, that wanted to see where this would go. His lips hovered so close to mine that I could feel the warmth of his breath, but he hesitated, as if waiting for me to make the next move. The tension between us was unbearable. The air so thick it was hard to breathe. "No one has to know," he said again, his voice soft, almost pleading. "It doesn't have to mean anything. It's just us. Just us." The words echoed in my mind, and for a split second, I considered it. What if no one ever found out? What if this could stay between us, just a secret that we kept locked away, never to be spoken of again? The thought was tempting. So tempting that I almost leaned in, almost gave in to the moment. But then, reality crashed back in, and I snapped out of the haze that had clouded my mind. "No, we can't," I said, finally finding my voice. I pulled away from him, stepping back, creating the distance I so desperately needed. "This isn't right. You know that." For a moment, Ryan just stood there, watching me, his expression unreadable. I could see the frustration in his eyes, the conflict, and it mirrored my own. He ran a hand through his hair and let out a heavy sigh. taking a step back as if trying to regain control of himself. "I know," he admitted, his voice quiet now, almost defeated. "But I don't know what to do about this. About you. I've tried to ignore it, but I can't stop thinking about you." His confession hung in the air between us, raw and unfiltered. It was the first time he'd said it out loud, the first time he'd admitted what had been simmering beneath the surface for months. And as much as I wanted to deny it, to pretend like it wasn't real, I couldn't, because the truth was, I'd been thinking about him too. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts, but it didn't help. Everything was too tangled up, too complicated. "You have to stop," I said, my voice firmer this time. "Whatever this is, it can't happen. We're not." Ryan's jaw clenched and he took another step back, putting more space between us. "I get it," he said, his voice tight. "I won't push anymore. But don't act like you don't feel it too. Don't lie to yourself." His words stung because they were true. I couldn't lie, not to him and not to myself. There was something between us, something undeniable. But that didn't mean it was right. "I'm not lying," I said quietly, more to convince myself than him. I need some space." Ryan nodded, though I could see the frustration in his eyes. He turned and walked toward the door, pausing before he left the kitchen. He glanced back at me, his gaze lingering for just a moment longer than it should have. "I'll give you space," he said, his voice softer now, almost resigned. "But it isn't over." And with that, he walked out, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen, my heart pounding, my mind spinning. I let out a shaky breath and leaned against the counter, trying to steady myself. But as much as I wanted to believe that putting distance between us would make this easier, I knew it wouldn't. Because no matter how much space I tried to create, the truth was, this wasn't over, not by a long shot. And there was so much more to come. The days that followed were anything but normal. Ryan and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was only out of necessity. The house felt too small, the walls pressing in on me, as if they knew about the secret we weren't talking about. Every time our paths crossed, there was a tension so thick, it felt like it would break at any second. I found myself avoiding him, staying in my room more than usual, or leaving the house whenever I could. But the distance didn't make things easier. If anything, it made me think about him more. I'd catch myself replaying that moment in the kitchen, the way his voice had dropped when he said no one would ever find out, the way his hand had lingered on my skin. I hated that those thoughts kept creeping in, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake them. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything changed. Our parents were out again, and I was sitting in the living room, mindlessly flipping through channels, trying to distract myself from the thoughts that had been haunting me all week. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the TV, and I hadn't seen Ryan all morning. Part of me hoped it would stay that way. But then, I heard footsteps coming down the stairs, slow and deliberate, the same way they'd been that day in the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat, and I knew it was him before he even appeared in the doorway. Ryan walked into the room, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. He stood there, just watching me, and I could feel the tension between us rising, thick and heavy, like it always did. I tried to focus on the TV, pretending I didn't notice him, but I could feel his gaze on me, burning into the back of my neck. Finally, he spoke. "We need to talk." I didn't look at him. "About what?" "You know what," he said, his voice firm but not angry. "About us." I sighed, sinking deeper into the couch. This was exactly what I'd been trying to avoid. "There is no us, Ryan. We talked about this already." He walked over to the couch, sitting down on the far end, keeping a safe distance between us. But even that wasn't enough to break the tension. It felt like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "You're lying," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving mine. "You're pretending like none of this matters, but I know you feel it too." I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my emotions in check. "It doesn't matter what I feel, it's wrong and you know it." "But why?" Ryan pressed, his voice soft but insistent. Why is it wrong? We're not hurting anyone. We're not even related by blood. What's stopping us? I felt a wave of frustration rise in me, not just at him but at the situation. He wasn't getting it. He didn't understand the weight of what he was asking. What's stopping us? I repeated, my voice a little sharper than I intended. Everything, Ryan, our parents, our family. The fact that this would ruin everything. We can't just pretend like none of that matters. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And then he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. You're scared, he said, his voice quiet but sure. You're scared of what this could mean, of what it could turn into. But that doesn't change the fact that we both know there's something between us. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words got stuck in my throat, because the truth was, he was right. I was scared of what would happen if we crossed that line, scared of what it would do to us, to our family, to everything we'd built since our parents got married. But at the same time, I couldn't deny what I'd been feeling, no matter how hard I tried to push it away. Ryan stood up, walking over to the window, his back to me. He started, his voice quieter now. I've been thinking about this a lot, about us, about how everything's changed since our parents got together. And I get why you're scared. I do. But I also know that you can't just ignore this. You can't pretend like it doesn't exist. I sat there, silent, my mind racing. What was I supposed to say? He was right, but that didn't make this any easier. In fact, it made it harder. I'm not asking you to make a decision right now, Ryan continued, turning back to face me. I just want you to think about it. Really think about it. Because this isn't going to go away, no matter how much space we put between us. His words hit me hard, sinking in deeper than I wanted them to, because I knew he was right. This wasn't just going to disappear, but that didn't mean I was ready to face it. I need time. I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. I need time to figure this out. Ryan nodded, his expression softening slightly. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. The room fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't as suffocating. There was still tension between us, but it felt different now, like we'd both acknowledged something we couldn't ignore any longer. Ryan turned to leave the room, and just before he disappeared through the doorway, he glanced back at me. Just remember, he said softly, no one ever has to find out. And with that, he was gone, leaving me alone with my thoughts, my heart pounding, and my mind spinning in 1,000 different directions. And the craziest part was that the most insane moment was yet to come. The days that followed were filled with silence. Ryan gave me the space I'd asked for, but it wasn't enough. The tension was still there, simmering beneath the surface, always present even when we weren't in the same room. I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said, that no one had to find out. It was a tempting thought, the idea that something so intense, so dangerous, could exist in secret, with no one the wiser. But secrets like that have a way of unraveling, don't they? One evening I was sitting in my room staring blankly at the wall, lost in thought, when I heard a soft knock at my door. My heart skipped a beat. I knew who it was before I even heard his voice. Can I come in? I hesitated. Yeah, I finally said, my voice barely audible. Ryan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He stood there for a moment, like he wasn't sure if he should stay or leave. But then, slowly, he crossed the room and sat down on the edge of my bed, his eyes never leaving mine. Have you thought about it? He asked quietly. I nodded, my throat tight. I had thought about it. Too much if I was being honest. I'd thought about everything that could go wrong, about how this could destroy everything we had. But I'd also thought about the way his touch had felt, the way his words had lingered in my mind long after he'd spoken them. Ryan reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and for a moment I froze. But this time I didn't pull away. His fingers curled around mine, and the warmth of his skin sent a shiver through me. It was such a small gesture, but it felt like it carried the weight of everything we weren't saying. No one ever has to know, he said again, his voice soft but insistent. It's just us. I looked at him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The conflict was still there, the fear of what we were risking. But there was something else, too, something that was pulling me toward him, no matter how hard I tried to fight it. Without thinking, I leaned in. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it was enough to close the gap between us. Ryan's breath hitched, and I felt the tension rise again. But this time it wasn't the kind of tension that made me want to run. It was the kind that made me want to see where this would go. Our lips hovered just inches apart, the air between us crackling with electricity. I could feel the weight of the moment, how everything seemed to hang in the balance. But then, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like we were testing the waters, unsure of what this meant. But then, slowly it deepened. Ryan's hand slid up to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and the world seemed to fall away. For that brief moment, it was just us. No parents, no consequences, no fear. Just us, tangled in a moment we couldn't take back. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths ragged, reality came crashing back in. I stared at him, my mind spinning. We'd crossed a line I'd promised myself we wouldn't cross. And now that we had, I wasn't sure what came next. I started, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't know what to say. What was there to say? Ryan looked at me, his expression unreadable. No one will ever find out, he said again, as if that could make everything okay. But I wasn't so sure, because no matter how much we tried to keep this secret, secrets have a way of coming out. And deep down, I knew this wasn't something we could hide forever. I don't know if I can do this, I whispered, my voice shaky. Ryan's hand slipped away from mine, and the space between us felt colder, emptier. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, looking as conflicted as I felt. I don't want to lose you, he said softly, and the vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. But if you're not ready, I'll back off. It was the last thing I expected him to say. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to say yes, to agree that this was a bad idea, that we needed to stop before it went too far. But another part of me, the part that had kissed him, didn't want to let go. I just need time, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan nodded, his expression softening. I'll wait. He stood up then, giving me one last look before turning and walking toward the door. But before he left, he glanced back at me, a small, bittersweet smile playing on his lips. I meant what I said, he added. No one will ever find out, but that doesn't mean you have to hide from yourself. And with that, he was gone, leaving me alone with the weight of everything that had just happened. My heart was still racing, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions I didn't know how to process. I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The days after that kiss were a blur. I tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, as if Ryan and I hadn't crossed a line that neither of us could uncross. But it was impossible. Every time I saw him, every time we were in the same room, the memory of that kiss came flooding back, and I could feel the weight of what we had done pressing down on me. Ryan was giving me space like he'd promised, but the tension hadn't gone anywhere. If anything, it felt more intense now, like there was a pressure building between us that neither of us knew how to release. I could see it in the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, the way his eyes would linger just a little too long, the way his fingers would brush mine in passing, sending sparks through me that I couldn't ignore. I wasn't sure what to do. I knew I should be trying to figure out how to make things right, how to step back from whatever this was before it went too far. But every time I thought about confronting him, about ending this for good, something held me back. The truth was, I didn't want to let go. Not yet. One night, I found myself lying in bed staring up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind was racing with thoughts of Ryan, of that kiss, of what it had meant, and what it might still mean. I couldn't shake the feeling that things between us weren't over, no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise. And then, as if on cue, there was a soft knock at my door. My heart leaped into my throat. I knew it was Ryan before I even heard his voice. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. I hesitated for a moment, torn between telling him to go away and letting him in. But in the end, I couldn't bring myself to push him away. "Yeah," I whispered. The door creaked open and Ryan stepped inside, his face partially hidden in the dim light of the hallway. He looked different tonight, softer, more vulnerable, like the weight of what had happened between us was pressing down on him just as hard as it was on me. He closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment, just watching me, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same battle that had been raging inside of me since that day in the kitchen. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about us, about everything." I sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around myself, my heart pounding in my chest. "Me too," I said softly. Ryan took a step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "I don't want to mess things up," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "But I can't stop thinking about you. I've tried, but it's not going away." I felt my chest tighten at his words. I had been telling myself the same thing, over and over, trying to convince myself that this was just a phase that it would pass. But hearing him say it out loud made it all feel so much more real. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice shaky. "I don't want to ruin everything, but—" I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but Ryan understood. He always did. He sat down on the edge of the bed, keeping a small but significant distance between us. His hand rested on the blanket, close enough to mine that I could feel the warmth of his skin, but far enough that the touch wasn't accidental. "We can stop," he said quietly, though his voice was filled with reluctance. "If that's what you want, I don't want to push you into something you're not ready for." I looked at him, my heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. He was giving me an outer chance to walk away from this before it spiraled out of control. But the problem was, I wasn't sure if I wanted to walk away. "I don't know what I want," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But I know that whatever this is, it's not going away, and I don't know how to deal with that." Ryan's hand moved then, slowly, hesitantly, until his fingers brushed against mine. The touch was so gentle, so tentative, and yet it sent a surge of warmth through me that I couldn't ignore. "I'll wait," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "As long as it takes, I'll wait." I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside of me. Part of me wanted to reach out, to close the distance between us, to give in to the pull that had been growing stronger with each passing day. But another part of me, the part that was terrified of what would happen if we went any further, held me back. "I just need time," I said, my voice trembling. Ryan nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "Take all the time you need." We sat there in silence for a long moment, the air between us heavy with everything we weren't saying. His hand rested lightly on mine, the warmth of his skin a constant reminder of the connection we couldn't deny, no matter how hard we tried. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ryan stood up. He glanced at me one last time, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite name, before turning and walking toward the door. But just before he left, he paused, his hand resting on the doorframe. "No matter what happens," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm here. You don't have to do this alone." And with that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet of my room, my heart still racing, my mind spinning with thoughts I couldn't control. I lay back down, pulling the blanket tighter around me, and closed my eyes. But sleep didn't come, because deep down, I knew that this wasn't over.